While you're trying to understand the avoidant person's confusing behavior, while you're analyzing their mixed signals and attempting to decode whether they're interested or indifferent, whether they want you or want space, the avoidant person is engaged in their own internal process that has nothing to do with your actual qualities or worthiness. They're making two simultaneous and contradictory decisions about you, evaluations that determine how they'll treat you and whether the relationship will continue. These decisions are not conscious or deliberate. They're automatic assessments that their wounded attachment system is running in the background, trying to answer two fundamental questions that shape every avoidant person's relationship patterns. The first decision is whether you're safe enough to keep around. This assessment evaluates whether you trigger their defenses too intensely, whether you demand too much intimacy or vulnerability, whether you threaten their independence and control in ways that make them need to escape. The second decision, operating simultaneously and in direct tension with the first, is whether you're important enough to fear losing. This assessment evaluates whether you've become significant enough that losing you would genuinely hurt them, whether you provide something they value highly enough that they're motivated to maintain access to you, despite the discomfort intimacy with you creates. These two decisions operate on different timelines and according to different criteria, and the avoidant person's behavior at any given moment reflects whichever decision is currently dominant in their awareness. When the safety assessment is paramount, you see withdrawal, distance, criticism, all the behaviors designed to reduce intimacy and restore their comfort. When the importance assessment is paramount, you see pursuit, closeness, expressions of care, all the behaviors designed to maintain connection and prevent loss. Understanding these two simultaneous decisions and how they interact explains the maddening hot and cold pattern, the approach avoidance dance, the way avoidants seem to want you and reject you in alternating waves. They're caught between two opposing drives, the drive to keep you at safe distance and the drive to keep you close enough that they don't lose you entirely. Decision 1. Whether you're safe enough to keep around. The first and most fundamental decision the avoidant person is making about you is whether you're safe enough to maintain in their life without triggering intolerable levels of anxiety and discomfort. This safety assessment is not about whether you're trustworthy or whether you'll hurt them intentionally. It's about whether being in relationship with you activates their core wounds and defenses to such a degree that the relationship feels unbearable. The avoidant person is constantly monitoring the relationship for signs of threat, and the threats they're watching for are not external dangers but internal experiences, feeling too vulnerable, too dependent, too controlled, too consumed by the relationship, too exposed in their authentic needs and feelings. The criteria the avoidant person uses to assess safety are inversely related to what creates healthy intimacy. They feel safer when you need them less, when you're more independent and self-sufficient, when you don't ask for much emotional presence or vulnerability, when you tolerate distance and inconsistency without protest, when you don't push for commitment or progression, when you accept ambiguity about the relationship's status and future. All of these factors that make them feel safer are the same factors that prevent genuine intimacy and partnership from developing. You make them feel safe by not requiring what relationships actually need to thrive, by accepting less than you deserve, by accommodating their limitations without expressing your own legitimate needs. Conversely, the avoidant person experiences you as unsafe when you express normal relationship needs and desires, when you want more time together, more emotional sharing, more consistency in communication, more clarity about commitment, more integration of your lives. You trigger their sense that the relationship is becoming too demanding, too consuming, too threatening to their defended independence. Your needs register as pressure, as attempts to control them, as evidence that you want more than they can give. This perception of your needs as threats rather than as normal components of partnership, is the core dysfunction that makes relationships with avoidance so difficult and ultimately unsustainable. The safety assessment is ongoing and constantly updating based on your behavior and the relationship's trajectory. Early in the relationship, when intimacy is still surface level and demands are minimal, you likely register as relatively safe. The avoidant person can engage with you without too much discomfort because the relationship hasn't yet triggered their deepest wounds. But as the relationship progresses, as natural intimacy develops, as you begin having expectations and needs, your safety rating decreases in their internal assessment. You become more threatening as you become more important, creating the paradox where the relationship's success in building closeness is what triggers the avoidance need to destroy that closeness. The avoidant person doesn't consciously think, this person is becoming unsafe. I need to create distance. The process is largely unconscious, manifesting as increasing discomfort when they're with you, growing irritation at things that didn't bother them before, focus on incompatibilities or problems they previously overlooked, general sense that the relationship feels wrong or suffocating, even though nothing specific has changed except the level of intimacy. This discomfort drives behavioral changes. They become less available, less responsive, more distant, more critical. They might pick fights or create drama that justifies creating space. They might suddenly need more time to themselves, more focus on work or friends, more independence and separation. These behaviors serve to restore their sense of safety by reducing the intimacy that was triggering their anxiety. When they create distance, when they reduce contact and emotional engagement, they feel relief. The pressure is off. They can breathe again. They've restored the buffer zone they need to feel comfortable. This relief reinforces the pattern, teaching them that distance equals safety and intimacy equals danger. The more they enact this pattern, the more entrenched it becomes, making it increasingly difficult for them to tolerate sustained closeness without periodic withdrawals to restore their equilibrium. The safety assessment also includes evaluation of how you respond to their withdrawal and distance creation. Do you protest loudly, become anxious or demanding, pursue them intensely when they pull back? If so, your response to their withdrawal makes you seem even less safe because it demonstrates that you need them and you're affected by their behavior, both of which increase their sense of being responsible for your emotional state and being controlled by your needs. But if you respond to their withdrawal with your own distance, with acceptance or indifference, with redirection of your attention elsewhere, you restore some safety by demonstrating you don't need them desperately and won't pressure them to be more present than they can comfortably be. This creates perverse dynamic where the avoidant feels safest with people who need them least, people who can take them or leave them, people who don't protest their withdrawal or require consistent presence. These are precisely the people who cannot build deep, intimate partnership because they're either not that invested or they have their own avoidant patterns. The people who could actually love the avoidant deeply and build meaningful relationship with them are the same people who trigger the strongest safety alarms because genuine love involves need and vulnerability that the avoidant experiences as threatening. The end point of the safety assessment, if you consistently trigger too much discomfort and anxiety in the avoidant person, is their decision that you're not safe to keep around. This decision results in the ending of the relationship or in such extreme withdrawal that the relationship becomes essentially non-existent while technically continuing. The avoidant person concludes, often unconsciously, that being with you costs them too much in terms of their comfort and sense of self. They cannot maintain the independence and emotional distance they need while being in relationship with you. Therefore, the relationship must end or must be reduced to something so minimal that it no longer threatens them. This ending is typically framed in terms that protect the avoidance ego and avoid acknowledging their actual reasons. They tell themselves and you that you're incompatible, that timing is wrong, that they're not ready for relationship, that you want different things. These explanations obscure the real reason. You became too close. You needed too much. You threatened their defenses too intensely, and they had to escape to restore their sense of safety. Understanding this real reason doesn't make the ending less painful, but it clarifies that the problem was never your worth or your adequacy. The problem was that you became important enough and close enough to trigger their deepest wounds, and they couldn't tolerate the discomfort that your importance created. Decision 2. Whether you're important enough to fear losing. Operating simultaneously with and in direct contradiction to the safety assessment is the second decision the avoidant person is making. Whether you've become important enough to them that losing you would be genuinely painful and therefore something they're motivated to prevent. This importance assessment evaluates different criteria than the safety assessment and often reaches opposite conclusions, creating the internal conflict that drives the avoidant's confusing hot and cold behavior. While part of them is evaluating whether you're too dangerous to keep around, another part is evaluating whether you're too valuable to let go. The importance assessment is based on whether you meet needs the avoidant person has, but typically doesn't acknowledge or consciously access. Despite their claims of not needing anyone, despite their presentation of complete self-sufficiency, avoidant people have the same fundamental human needs for connection, validation, companionship, and love that everyone has. They've learned to suppress awareness of these needs and to meet them in limited, defended ways, but the needs exist nonetheless. When you meet these needs effectively, when you provide validation, appreciation, companionship, affection, or support that the avoidant person values, you become important to them, whether they consciously acknowledge that importance or not. The criteria that make you important are different from, and often contradictory to the criteria that make you safe. You become important when the avoidant person genuinely enjoys your company, when they feel seen and appreciated by you, when you provide emotional or practical support they value, when time with you enhances their life in ways they notice, when you boost their ego or make them feel desirable, when you understand them in ways others don't. All of these factors increase your importance, but many of them also decrease your safety rating because they represent ways you're affecting them, ways they're depending on you, ways they've allowed you to matter. The avoidant person often doesn't recognize your importance until they face the possibility of losing you. During the relationship, while you're consistently available and invested, they can take you for granted, focusing on the ways you trigger their discomfort while minimizing the value you provide. But when you pull back, when you stop pursuing, when you demonstrate that you might leave or that you're directing your attention elsewhere, the avoidant person suddenly becomes aware of what they stand to lose. The threat of loss activates different anxiety than the anxiety about intimacy, and this loss anxiety brings your importance into sharp focus. This is when you see the avoidant person pursue, when they demonstrate interest and investment they weren't showing before, when they express feelings they'd been withholding, when they make efforts they'd been unwilling to make. This pursuit is not evidence that they've suddenly developed capacity for intimacy. It's evidence that their loss anxiety has temporarily exceeded their intimacy anxiety, shifting which decision is dominant in their awareness. In this state, they're focused on your importance rather than on whether you're safe, and this focus drives approach behavior designed to secure your continued presence in their life. The importance assessment also updates based on comparison and circumstances. If the avoidant person explores other options and finds them lacking, your importance increases because you compare favorably to alternatives. If they go through a difficult period where they need support, your importance increases if you provide that support effectively. If they see you with someone else or hear you're dating, your importance spikes because the threat of loss becomes concrete rather than abstract. If they experience loneliness or emptiness during periods apart from you, your importance increases as they recognize how much your presence was contributing to their well-being, even if they didn't consciously appreciate it at the time. The challenge is that increased importance typically leads to increased intimacy anxiety once the immediate threat of loss is resolved. When the avoidant person pursues you and successfully restores connection, when they've secured your availability again, the loss anxiety that was driving their pursuit decreases. As loss anxiety decreases, intimacy anxiety reasserts itself, and the safety assessment becomes dominant again. You're still important to them, but now that they have you back, that importance feels threatening rather than motivating. They've allowed themselves to need you, to depend on you, to care about you visibly, and all of this feels unbearably vulnerable now that the crisis of potential loss has passed. This cycle of pursuing when faced with loss and withdrawing when connection is restored is the signature pattern of avoidant attachment. It's driven by the shifting dominance of these two assessments and the two different anxieties they generate. The avoidant person is caught in an endless loop where your importance drives them toward you when they fear losing you, but your importance also makes intimacy with you feel dangerous, which drives them away once they feel secure in your availability. They cannot resolve this contradiction without addressing the underlying wounds and beliefs that create both the fear of intimacy and the fear of loss. The importance you hold for the avoidant person is also often conditional and based on specific qualities or functions you serve, rather than on holistic appreciation of you as complete person. You might be important because you make them feel attractive or successful, because you're a good audience for their stories, because you provide sex without demanding too much emotional intimacy, because you fit into their life in ways that are convenient, because you boost their status socially. This functional importance is different from the deep valuing that comes from genuine, intimate knowing, and it's more fragile because it depends on you continuing to serve the functions they value without requiring reciprocity or deeper connection that would threaten them. The end point of the importance assessment, if you've become deeply important to the avoidant person, is complicated by their inability to translate that importance into sustained commitment and presence. They might recognize intellectually that you're important, that they don't want to lose you, that you add value to their life, but this recognition doesn't override their intimacy anxiety or their defensive patterns. They remain caught between wanting to keep you and needing to maintain distance from you, unable to fully commit and unable to fully let go, creating the ambiguous, painful dynamic where you're important enough to keep around, but not important enough to actually prioritize or show up for consistently. How these contradictory decisions create the push-pull dynamic, the simultaneous operation of these two contradictory assessments, one determining whether you're safe enough to keep around, and one determining whether you're important enough to fear losing, is what creates the maddening push-pull dynamic that characterizes relationships with avoidant people. At any given moment, the avoidant person's behavior reflects whichever assessment and whichever anxiety is currently dominant in their awareness. When safety concerns dominate, you experience the push, withdrawal, distance, criticism, all behaviors designed to restore their comfort by reducing intimacy. When importance concerns dominate, you experience the pull, pursuit, closeness, expressions of care, all behaviors designed to prevent loss by maintaining connection. The shifting between these states is not random or unpredictable once you understand the mechanism. The avoidant person pushes when intimacy has increased to levels that trigger their defenses, when they've been spending too much time with you, when you've been expressing needs or expectations, when they're feeling too vulnerable or too dependent. The push is their system's way of restoring equilibrium by creating the distance they need to feel safe again. This push can be gentle and gradual, a slow withdrawal of presence and investment, or it can be sudden and intense, a dramatic creation of distance through conflict, or even ending the relationship. The pull happens when the avoidant person faces the possibility of losing you, when their distance has created enough separation that they begin experiencing loss anxiety, when they perceive that you're moving on or directing your attention elsewhere, when they realize through your absence how much they were depending on or enjoying what you provided. The pull is their system's way of securing your continued availability, of preventing the loss they suddenly fear. This pull can also vary in intensity, from subtle increases in contact and warmth to intense pursuit and declarations of feeling. What makes this dynamic so painful and confusing for partners is that the push and pull feel arbitrary and unrelated to anything you're doing. You haven't changed your behavior, but suddenly, the avoidant person who was warm yesterday is cold today. You've been giving them space, and suddenly, they're pursuing you intensely. The inconsistency creates constant uncertainty and anxiety because you cannot predict which version of the avoidant person you'll encounter or what will trigger the shift from one state to the other. You're left walking on eggshells, trying to find the impossible balance where you're close enough to keep them engaged, but distant enough not to trigger their withdrawal. The push-pull dynamic also tends to intensify over time, rather than stabilizing. As the relationship continues, as you become more important to the avoidant person, both the intimacy anxiety and the loss anxiety increase. Greater importance means losing you would hurt more, which increases loss anxiety and drives more intense pursuit when they fear losing you. But greater importance also means greater vulnerability and dependence, which increases intimacy anxiety and drives more intense withdrawal when they feel too close. The amplitude of the swings between pushing and pulling grows larger, making the relationship increasingly volatile and unstable. This dynamic is also self-reinforcing through the responses it triggers in partners. When the avoidant pushes, creating distance and withdrawal, partners typically respond with pursuit, trying to restore closeness and figure out what's wrong. This pursuit makes the avoidant feel pressured and unsafe, triggering more withdrawal. But when partners eventually exhaust themselves and stop pursuing, when they pull back and redirect their energy elsewhere, the avoidant experiences this as threat of loss and begins pulling, pursuing, to restore connection. This pursuit makes the partner feel hopeful and they re-engage, which soon triggers the avoidant's intimacy, anxiety, and the cycle begins again. Breaking this cycle requires one or both people to change their responses to the pattern. The avoidant person needs to recognize their pattern, understand the dual anxieties driving it, and develop capacity to tolerate intimacy, anxiety without automatically withdrawing, and to tolerate loss anxiety without desperately pursuing. This development requires substantial therapeutic work and is not something most avoidants undertake without significant motivation. The partner needs to recognize the pattern, understand that it's not about them or their worth, and establish boundaries that protect them from the emotional whiplash the push-pull creates. This might mean refusing to participate in the dynamic, maintaining consistent boundaries, regardless of whether the avoidant is pushing or pulling, or ultimately leaving the relationship because the dynamic is too damaging to their well-being. The push-pull dynamic also reveals why advice to play hard to get or to create strategic distance with avoidance is fundamentally flawed. While creating distance might activate the avoidance loss anxiety and trigger pursuit in the short term, this pursuit is not evidence of increased capacity for intimacy. It's evidence that you've activated the importance assessment by threatening loss. As soon as they secure your availability again, the intimacy anxiety will reassert itself and they'll push again. You haven't created conditions for sustained closeness. You've simply triggered the pull phase of their cycle, which will inevitably be followed by the push phase once the threat of loss is resolved. What happens when they make their final choice? Eventually, the avoidant person's dual assessment process reaches some form of resolution where one decision becomes definitively dominant and drives their final choice about the relationship. This final choice typically takes one of three forms, each reflecting different resolution of the tension between safety concerns and importance concerns. Understanding these possible outcomes helps clarify what you're working toward or against in relationship with an avoidant person and what final choice likely awaits if patterns don't fundamentally change. The first possible outcome is that the safety concerns definitively win, and the avoidant person concludes you're not safe enough to keep in their life. This outcome occurs when their intimacy anxiety consistently exceeds their loss. Anxiety, when the discomfort of being with you outweighs the pain of losing you, when they cannot find any distance or arrangement that makes the relationship tolerable. This decision results in the avoidant ending the relationship, either clearly through direct conversation or ambiguously through extreme withdrawal that makes the relationship essentially non-existent. They've decided that their comfort and sense of safety are more important than maintaining access to what you provide. This ending is often framed as being about incompatibility or circumstances rather than about their discomfort with intimacy, protecting the avoidance ego and their narrative about themselves. They convince themselves and tell you that you wanted different things, that timing was wrong, that you're better suited for different people. These explanations obscure that the real reason is that you became close enough to trigger defenses they couldn't override, that you needed more than they could provide while maintaining their defended comfort, that the relationship required vulnerability they couldn't sustain. The ending might feel sudden to you, but for the avoidant person, it's the culmination of extended internal struggle, where they've been trying to make the relationship tolerable and have finally concluded they cannot. The second possible outcome is that the importance concerns definitively win, and the avoidant person concludes you're too valuable to lose, despite the discomfort intimacy with you creates. This outcome is rare and typically only occurs under specific conditions. The avoidant person does substantial therapeutic work that increases their capacity to tolerate intimacy, anxiety. They encounter circumstances that make them acutely aware of your value and the cost of losing you. Or they mature to a point where their capacity for intimacy naturally expands. When this outcome occurs, you see the avoidant person making genuine efforts to show up differently, to tolerate discomfort rather than automatically withdrawing, to address their patterns rather than enacting them unconsciously. This outcome is what most people hope for when they're in relationship with avoidant person, but it's important to understand how rare it is and what conditions make it possible. The avoidant person must recognize their patterns clearly enough to understand what's at stake. They must value you highly enough that the fear of losing you motivates difficult change work, and they must actually do that work consistently rather than just having moments of insight or making temporary efforts. Most avoidants never reach this point because their defenses are too strong, their discomfort with intimacy too intense, or their ability to find new options too available. They can find someone else who won't trigger them as intensely, rather than doing the work to tolerate being triggered by you. The third and most common outcome is an ambiguous middle ground where neither decision fully wins and the avoidant person maintains relationship with you that never deepens or progresses beyond certain point. They've concluded you're valuable enough to keep around but not safe enough to get closer to, creating relationship that exists in perpetual limbo. This outcome manifests as relationships that last for years without any movement toward greater commitment or intimacy, as on again, off again patterns that cycle indefinitely, as situationships that never become defined partnerships, or as relationships that remain at surface level of connection without ever accessing genuine vulnerability and depth. This ambiguous outcome serves the avoidant person's needs by allowing them to maintain access to what you provide while never having to fully commit or become genuinely vulnerable. They keep you available as option while preventing the relationship from developing in ways that would increase their discomfort. For partners, this outcome is often the most frustrating and painful because there's enough connection to maintain hope, but never enough progression to build actual partnership. You're stuck waiting for relationship to become what it's never going to become, investing in potential that will never be realized, accepting breadcrumbs while hoping for genuine nourishment. The final choice the avoidant person makes is heavily influenced by factors beyond the relationship itself: their age and life stage, their other options, their circumstances, their level of self-awareness, whether they're in therapy. Younger avoidants with many options are more likely to choose ending relationships rather than doing the work intimacy requires. Older avoidants who are facing loneliness and seeing peers in committed relationships might be more motivated to address their patterns. Avoidants going through crises or transitions might be more open to vulnerability and change, but none of these factors guarantees the outcome you hope for, and waiting for perfect circumstances to motivate the avoidant person to choose you definitively is often waiting for something that will never arrive. Understanding that the avoidant person is making these two big decisions about you, assessing whether you're safe enough to keep around and whether you're important enough to fear losing, clarifies that their confusing behavior is not random or about your inadequacy. It's driven by internal conflict between competing needs and fears that most avoidants cannot resolve without substantial work. Your job is not to make yourself safe enough that they don't withdraw or important enough that they cannot let you go. Your job is to recognize the pattern, understand what's actually happening, and decide whether you want to remain in dynamic that will likely continue indefinitely unless the avoidant person does work that most of them never do.